Well, welcome. I'm glad we drew such a riveting crowd of enthusiasts for Wisconsin's infrastructure funding crisis. I think the reflection here is an accurate reflection of the seriousness with which our state's lawmakers are taking this problem. I don't say that glibly. In fact, I say that very gravely, because as somebody who plans to live in this state for a really long time, I am genuinely concerned about the state of our infrastructure and the long-term financial crisis that our state's legislature's refusal to grapple with the true cost of roads is creating for future generations. Us, but also our generation's kids and the generations beyond that. And so I thought it was important to bring together a group of local voices to try and capture the perspectives of both business and government at the local level and be able to amplify the shared concerns, because I think a lot of people will assume that government, which is like this side of the table, and business, which is represented by these folks over here, I think the assumption is there's going to be a big difference. There's going to be a lot of disagreement and everyone's looking at it differently. And maybe we'll find out that that's not actually the case at all, that local voices are actually quite unified on what they'd like to see the state do on this. I'm going to start out by introducing our panelists. We're going to have a round of yes/no questions to kind of set the tone of where we stand on some of those biggest issues. And then we're going to dig in asking our local government representatives a series of questions. We'll get some questions for our business representatives, and then we want to hear from you as well. And those of you at home who are tuned in, maybe you're at work, maybe you're at home, maybe you're sitting at the library, wherever you are watching us on this live streaming video, we appreciate you being a part of this event as well. If you have questions for us, we invite you to leave them in the Facebook comments or to tweet at WHBY. We'll be monitoring that throughout the event, and we appreciate you participating virtually from wherever you are joining us tonight. We do have some folks here who braved the cold and made it out to the event here at the Outer Edge, and we thank the Outer Edge in downtown Appleton, home of Celebration Church, for hosting us tonight. Thank you, Aubrey. All right, let's start with introductions. First up is County Executive Mark Harris. Executive Harris, thanks for being here. Yeah, absolutely. Next to him is Jeff Nguyen. Jeff is chair of the Outagamie County Board and a member of the Grand Chute Town Board. So Jeff has both county and town perspectives on this issue. Thanks for being here tonight, Jeff. Next to Jeff is James Fenlon. James is the administrator of the Village of Little Chute. James, how long have you been in that job now? 4 years as administrator of Little Chute, right in the heart of the Fox Valley. And seated next to him is Dean Steingraber, the Outagamie County Highway Commissioner. Thanks for being here, Dean. And representing our business interests at this panel, first, Phil Ramlett, who is president and CEO of Omni Associates. Phil, thanks for being here. And next to him is Pam Seidel. Pam is executive director of the Fox Cities Convention and Visitors Bureau, and also a longtime friend of mine. Pam, thanks for being here. Also, side note, my very first guest on Fresh Take ever. Thank you, Pam. We've been doing this for a long time, haven't we? And finally, Paul Menon is joining us. Paul is with Lamers Bus Lines, certainly an industry for whom infrastructure and roads are very important. Paul, thanks for being here. All right, so we're going to start out, folks, with these yes/no questions. I'll ask you, Mark, to pick up the microphone, and you can just pass it right down the line. My first question for you is this. Revenue is an issue. Should the state of Wisconsin index the gas tax to inflation? That's one of the solutions that has been proposed. Yes or no, do you think we should index the gas tax to inflation?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, and just pass that right down the line.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Keep going, yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, with some stipulations.
Okay, there we go. We'll get into some of those stipulations in a moment. You can hold that because we're going to send it right back down with the next one. We've already found some agreement there. And I do want to point out both Mark and Jeff are elected local government leaders, and James and Dean are appointed or hired leaders. And so we've got both the elected and the non-elected officials represented on the panel. Next question, Paul, will have you start out. Should Wisconsin adopt tolling on our highways?
I would say no.
No? Okay. Pam?
No.
Maybe.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
Maybe.
All right.
No.
Maybe.
All right, we got some maybes. And Mark?
No.
No, all right. So some no's and some maybes on tolling. We will come back to that issue, knowing it has been talked about, and as far as I know, would be quite expensive to possibly implement, but we'll ask some of those questions in a little bit. Here's another question that is maybe of particular interest to residents of the Fox Valley, as this is an issue we have talked about quite a bit here, and that is, should the state allow regions to form transit authorities, allowing communities to pool together on resources to tackle transportation issues? Should there be authorization for regional transit authorities? Mark?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes with stipulations.
All right, I like it. I sense Paul's going to have some interesting insights for us on that end of the table. Regional Transit Authority is something that has been talked about for years and years and years in this area, and just can't quite seem to get over the hump in Madison. We can maybe explore that a little later, why that might be. Our next and final yes-no question, Paul, we'll start with you once again. Should Wisconsin dedicate transportation-related sales tax revenue, so not gas tax, but sales tax revenue from transportation-related purchases like automobiles, should they dedicate that funding source to fund infrastructure instead of going with the rest of sales tax into the general fund?
I would support that.
Okay, we'll take that as a yes.
Maybe.
Okay,
Yes.
all right.
Yes.
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 No.
All right, that is a perfect place to start. Mark, I appreciate that. Can you tell us a little bit why you wouldn't support that move?
Well, currently, the sales tax, and a large portion of our sales tax comes from the sale of vehicles. That goes into general purpose revenue, and general purpose revenue funds things like schools, healthcare, helps with municipalities. If you reallocate that to transportation, then you create a hole in other budgets. So my initial reaction would be no, unless you had some way to replace that revenue.
Interesting. Well, so Jeff, let's talk about that a little bit. Continuing on that theme, would you support redirecting that revenue because you think funding roads is more important than what that revenue is already going towards? Or would you support backfilling with other additional revenues should that be redirected?
I think it would have to be backfilled.
Okay. James, thoughts on that from the local perspective about sort of redirecting a state fund and then having to come up with that from somewhere else?
I think it'd probably be best to be part of a larger tax policy discussion, whether that's discussions about property tax or other forms of revenue. But I definitely wouldn't say you wouldn't replace the lost revenue. You'd increase the tax, quite frankly.
Yeah. Dean, your perspective, as somebody who is implementing transportation policy at the local level, you're obviously focused on roads. You want to get as much funding for those projects as possible. Do you see the need to then be able to backfill what would be redirected sales tax revenue?
Well, I guess why I said yes was that it just, bottom line, we need more transportation funds, period. And want to make sure that all options are available. And as you see, I think in this last budget, that they are starting to look at some of those things, little bits and pieces, probably not enough, so that's why I said yes.
Okay.
I don't know if I understand all of those other things that these guys here are talking about, but as far as my concern is just want more dollars going in towards those roads.
Okay. We're going to stick with our government panel here for just a second, and starting with you, Dean and James, as the implementers, as the ones who are putting these policies into practice and dealing with the policies as they are set. Dean, we'll start with you. How does unpredictable funding streams for transportation make your job harder? Does it make your job harder? And if so, how?
Well, of course, unpredictability is not good for anybody, and the more predictable you can make it and more consistent and steady and sustainable, it's going to make our jobs a lot easier. But I think the big issue, again, is for us to try to build a plan out far enough in advance, both the areas of maintenance and how we're maintaining roads, but also planning on upgrades and improvements to the old system that needs to be upgraded. So planning is so important.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that planning? What does that time horizon look like, and what sort of decisions are made at your level versus the level of the elected leaders?
I think we all do it pretty well together as far as the elected and the staff. As far as we're typically looking at a 5-year capital improvement plan. I think in our office, though, the people that are working with it on a day-to-day basis, we do stretch it out there to 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe not as detailed as that 5-year, but we're looking out there and saying, hey, this baby's going to last us 20 years. This one's going to last us 15. That bridge is in 5 years. And so we're working on that every day. But together, the elected officials, all the department heads, our staff, are really focusing on this document right here, the 5-year plan. And that's what we're doing. As far as maintenance and those type of things, those are maybe not 5-year, but you're looking at 3- and 2-year type plans. Okay. And then when you have snow plowing and that kind of stuff, you're going day by day, unfortunately, and you're reacting to what's going on out there with the weather. Yeah. Now, of course, when you start looking at something like snow plowing, you're looking at equipment and you're looking at routes and optimizing those routes and planning that out in a lot longer time frame. Yeah. But the actual work that the guys do and get out there, that's a day-to-day thing.
Yeah. James, talk a little bit about the planning you do at the village level, and for that viewer, that member of the audience who might be thinking, gosh, my street really could use replacement. How do you plan? What does that cycle look like?
So really the planning starts with analysis of the road surface itself, along with utilities. So every year our team is looking at or conducting a PASER rating, so rating the road surface. We try to match that rating up then with the underground utilities, so that if we are going to reconstruct a street, we're looking both at both pieces because it's very integral. And then from there, it's a 5-year planning process. To Dean's comments, staff are looking out, maybe 10 on major portions. So that's really the planning process, but it really starts annually with that PASER rating and then staff discussions with Public Works and Engineering. If I could just touch on the predictability portion, please. In Wisconsin, municipalities are really funded by property tax, primarily anyway at the village level or city level. And that's a very predictable revenue. You know what you're going to get every year, which is a great thing. The problem is property tax is a very unpopular tax, so people don't want to pay their property tax. Wisconsin municipalities, most of our funding, I believe it's over 90%, is really generally from property tax. So that's a problem from a transportation perspective. And then just finally, I'd just say that every year you can't say that a road project's going to be $3 million every year. You may have a larger project, more complex in scale, that may be $5 million. But with levy limits and those types of restraints, I can't necessarily then say, well, I'm going to save for this, or you're almost forced to bond. And so then it becomes an even more costly venture. So the system is set up to almost push municipalities to bond, and that is not an effective policy directive.
Yeah. That combination of state transfer aid to local governments to help fund transportation, and then on the other hand, levy limits that restrict the amount of revenue local governments can raise for themselves. You're saying that creates kind of an incentive to spend and borrow at the local level because you can't save up for those longer term projects?
You can save up, but part of your aid, the general transportation aid that we rely on so heavily, is based on what you spent the previous 5 years. So if you have a year where you have a dip in spending because you want to save for that big project, well, then your aids are going to go down because your 5-year average is decreased. So there's this kind of push-pull going on, and you end up in this process where you're almost pushed to be in the bond market, which is a costly venture, but at the end of the day, that's kind of the position we're put in.
Yeah. Jeff, going to you next, looking at, now you can tell me, you want to talk about the county level or you want to talk about the town level when it comes to this state funding formula and how it creates perhaps unintended or distorted incentives in the kind of decisions you have to make as an elected leader?
Well, I think going back to your original question on the indexing, that stopped in 2006.
Right.
So it's been almost a little over 11 years. Mm-hmm. At that time, the gas tax in Wisconsin was just under 31 cents a gallon. That's where it still is now. Had they continued indexing, we'd be about 6 cents more than we were 11 years ago. But in the meantime, we've lost $1.2 billion in revenues that could have benefited towns, counties, and the state. And so, to your question about unpredictability, that would have made things much more predictable.
Is there any specific change to state aid formulas or transfer payments that you have in mind that if you could wave a magic wand, you'd like to see changed in state law?
Yeah, well, I think, go back to the index.
Okay.
Would certainly make things a lot simpler.
Again, just
for
growing the size
everyone.
of that pie.
And to James's point, it keeps that part off property taxes and puts it back on the ultimate user, the consumer at the pump.
Right.
Who would be much happier paying a couple pennies more at the gas pump than they would seeing an increase in their property taxes. Or, as James mentioned, for example, at the county in our budget this year, we are borrowing $28 million. Just under $5 million of that is for road projects.
Wow. This is a big portion of the budget that the county just
Correct.
passed, yes?
Yep.
Yeah? Mark, talk a little bit about that from the Winnebago County perspective. How big of transportation funding, how big of a part of your overall budget is that? And is there any changes you'd like to see to those transfer payment formulas if you had a magic wand?
It's a complicated question because the aid for highway maintenance and bridge maintenance, it comes in a lot of different pieces. And actually, the state support for this next coming year has actually gotten pretty good under the budget. Where I see a greater problem is that when we go to do a county highway, we're often looking for federal and state participation in the projects. And both the state government and the federal government have exhausted their funds. So that you have to wait to see if they're going to appropriate general funds and move those into transportation so that they'll be able to proceed with the projects. And clearly there's a need for them to push projects back if they don't have adequate funding streams. And that's going to make it very unpredictable of when you can actually complete a project and how long you're going to have to wait for that federal and state participation.
So is there a prospect for consolidating or streamlining these aid formulas? Could they all be combined into one pot for all purposes? Is that realistic? Or would that be a good thing? Maybe that wouldn't be helpful.
Well,
I mean, simplicity isn't always better, right?
usually when a government talks about block granting funds, combining a whole bunch of different sources of fund into a single pot, they're usually talking about substantially reducing the support and then letting you sort out where you take the
Right.
losses. I would not be anxious to have that done.
Okay. So having those different buckets at least identifies designated funding for each of those purposes. You at least know you're getting something for all of them.
That's right.
Interesting. Okay. Any other comments on sort of the efficiencies or problems with the transfer payments? Otherwise, I want to move on to public transit. Can we start with public transit? Mark, do you have thoughts on how the state could better support local governments in providing public transit options?
Well, definitely there's a need for the transit authorities. Some of the communities in this area are reaching population thresholds, and if the communities are aggregated, that they'll lose federal funding.
Right.
And, or they'll not be able to use the federal funding to subsidize bus fares. They will have to only use it on new equipment, which may not be the urgent need. So you may have to have a transit authority in order to hold down the bus fares to a reasonable cost for the population that's relying on public transportation.
And do you think that would be a good direction to go in? Is providing more funding for public transit? Is that something you would prioritize?
Yes, and I think Appleton and Valley Transit could use an RTA right now.
Yeah. And that's been a conversation for a long time in these parts of trying to get that authority. Jeff, can you speak to that a little bit? Public transit or the regional transit authority, that sort of combining efforts on public transit?
Yeah, I agree with what Mark said. It's been a topic for years in this area. I know they're looking right now, I sit on the Transportation Committee for East Central, extending or trying to develop transit between the Fox cities and Oshkosh, particularly for employers, for students. So, yeah, it's definitely time.
Yeah. James, thoughts about that regional transit authority?
Yeah, well,
Or
I
public
think,
transit, either
yeah,
side?
at a larger level, you would talk about local control, whether it's in transportation or anything else. I would say that folks in Little Chute or Grand Chute or at the county level, wherever you may be, we have our finger on the pulse. We're meeting with our constituents daily, and it's not that the state isn't, but when you take those decisions and take them down to Madison or out to Washington, it's a little harder for us in the Fox Cities or even in Little Chute to really control our own destiny. What's good for the Fox Cities may not be good for Milwaukee or Madison. We probably have, if anybody knows what's good for Fox Cities, it's us. So we should be at that point. And in general, though, regional transit in general is something that I personally support. Having grew up in Wisconsin, lived on the East Coast, I was a steady user of transit, both sub and bus. Unfortunately, geography-wise, sometimes we're not best suited here, but at the end of the day, it definitely fits a big gap for a certain segment of our population. And if used properly and scheduled properly, can meet the needs for employers and our residents in a very impactful way.
Yeah. Dean, as highway commissioner, does public transit or anything else fall under your purview? Is that something that you're working on? Or are you dedicated specifically to highways?
Yeah, we're into the highways.
Okay.
We
Please.
go to a few meetings, and you hear a few things, and I do support that regional authority as well. And what we hope for, from our point of view as highways, is that we have a healthy transit program there that can take cars and the commuters off the roads. Because as we look at our various very high capacity highways, we're struggling in those areas. You just take a look at Highway 41, and you take a look at some of the other ones that are out there that are with all those cars commuting to work and commuting to school and all that. It'd sure be nice if we can get some of those off, if we had a good transit system that can serve that need.
Since you bring up that question specifically of getting cars off the road, taking commuters off the road to reduce the burden or the wear and tear on the infrastructure that is in place, I know I'm on the radio in the mornings. We often hear about the backups on 41, be it north or southbound, right around between Northland and Wrightstown, the part of I-41 that's down to 2 lanes in each direction. Would you advocate for, have you asked for, that stretch of 41 to expand to 3 lanes in each direction? Would that be a good thing?
Every day.
About as definitive an answer we're going to get. What would it take to make that happen?
Wow. Money.
Okay.
Lots of it. Planning. Lots of it. The project 41 needs to be enumerated at the state level. Legislation has to happen. We have to have the support of the governor, the legislators, to get that to happen. We've been really communicating here with the businesses here recently, and we're going to try to find out if we're barking up the right tree and see where they stand on it and how it affects them. And everyone that we've talked to so far is just saying, wow, we didn't realize that thing wasn't even on schedule. It isn't. It's not enumerated. It's not ready. It's going to be 10, 15, 20 years before that would happen. Right. Phil would probably have a better handle as to how long that would take, but it's a long time. Yeah. And right now we are at and exceeding capacity in many of those areas. And it's kind of sad as you see. One thing I'm really passionate about is we have 80 people that work at the highway department. Those guys go out on the roads to maintain the roads, plowing snow, patching potholes, fixing signs. And all of a sudden we have to send them out there on Highway 41, and they're taking their lives into their hands there, going on out there and doing that. And I'm very concerned about that. If we could get a better system out there where we could shut a lane down. Right now we cannot shut a lane down out on the 2-lane section because there's just too much traffic, and we'd cause more accidents. So we got to do some of that stuff at night, and that's not really safe either. But then when there is an accident out there, we still have to go on out there, and I put those guys in harm's way, and I don't like that.
Let's bring the mic back down here. I want to ask you, County Executive Harris, you've had several major highway projects in Winnebago County in the past few years, some recently completed, others still underway. Talk a little bit about the benefit to your residents of your county of having those projects. Obviously, it's not very convenient while it's happening. What are those long-term benefits that come from highway expansion projects?
Well, I think commuters in my county save time on a daily basis because of the excellent condition of 41 through Winnebago County. But it's also made Winnebago County more popular as a destination for business to invest. And that's one of the big features they look at now is almost every business worries about having an adequate workforce. And the proximity to quality highways is a big issue for them because that determines how quickly that workforce and how far away they can commute from. So it's an important issue for business growth and for the convenience and time savings of everyone.
I want to get to one final issue here with the government before we move on to the business side of the panel, and that question is this. How concerned are you, and how concerned should we be about the debt the state has accumulated over the past few years of kicking the can down the road and not grappling with this crisis?
We should be very concerned. This fiscal year for the state, 20% of the designated revenues for transportation are going to go to debt service. The next year, it'll be 21% of the designated revenues, gas tax and registration fees, that will be going to debt service. We're also not repairing the roads at the rate that they're wearing out. So you're leaving the next generation with two types of deficit. One, you're heading towards a point where all the designated revenues serve debt on projects already done, so that the next generation won't have money to maintain their highways. And you're also leaving them a system that may be in poorer shape than the one that we inherited. And I think both of those are wrong.
Yeah. Jeff, thoughts on that? How concerned are you about the debt that's been accumulated at the state level?
I agree with everything Mark said. I ran a business for 30 years, and I didn't operate it on debt. You don't run your household that way, and it's creating issues for our children, our grandchildren, and as Mark said, the infrastructure continues to suffer, and the can just keeps getting kicked down the road. And to Dean's point, it's really, we've had conversations about the fact that Highway 41 through the Fox Cities isn't even on the radar for the next 20 years, which is a real challenge when you figure it's been improved in Winnebago County, it's been improved in Brown County.
Right.
Well, that's like running plumbing through your house where you got 6-inch pipe here, 6-inch pipe here, and it goes down to a 2-inch
Right.
pipe. And so that's why
We see the backups.
every day.
Right. And we do. We see it almost every day. There's some problem, some issue, some slowdown.
But seriously, it really is an issue that can't continue to accumulate that kind of debt and just push the problem off on the next generation.
Yeah, thank you. James, thoughts on the debt at the state level?
Yeah, I think these two gentlemen hit the nail on the head. Even in Little Chute, we are, get concerned about that in our own, running the village government there. And it's not sustainable. It's something that makes us less efficient. We're less able to be flexible in future years, and it's just not a good place to be in. To go back to what Executive Harris said about, I view transportation funding as an economic development tool. Since the designation of I-41, all communities have had a leg up, so to speak, in a regional economic development perspective. Without the expansion of I-41, we could see ourselves be in a position where certain projects won't locate there, to the points that Mark made about employment and people being able to effectively transit back and forth. So I view it not just as important as safe transit as an economic development issue.
Excellent. Dean, thoughts on that from the perspective of a highway commissioner? What do you see when you see this debt piling up and this refusal to kind of grapple with the real cost of these projects?
Yeah, I think I've been a part of a lot of bonding packages over in Waupaca County, and that's really, when I was over in Waupaca County for 17 years, that was the only way we were going to get anything done, because they just didn't have a big enough property tax base. So we did a lot of it, but we always sat there and said, but the interest rates are low.
I've heard
Interest rates are low, so
Yes.
bonding is favorable. We've always heard that. But will it always be that way? And when it does go the other way, and it probably will someday, what's in its place? What's there? And then there'll be knee-jerk reactions here or there. So I think that's my concern, and it's not sustainable. There's a lot of other mechanisms out there that would be better. Cash is always better.
Yeah. All right, let's start with our business end of the panel here. Phil Ramlett from Omni. Let's start out by, would you explain to us the role Omni has with the state's infrastructure, with the work that you do for those who might not be familiar?
We've worked with a number of clients around Wisconsin that have transportation-related facilities. We've been the general consultant down at Whitman Regional Airport, down at Oshkosh. EAA is also one of our clients down there. Appleton International Airport is a longtime client. And then Outagamie County is our longest running, Outagamie County Highway is our longest running transportation client. We've been involved with numerous projects throughout the years. And I will say that the economic development that's happened in northeastern Wisconsin really is a product of our infrastructure and our transportation facilities here.
So that is really the bedrock of all the economic activity that's happening in the state. As James mentioned, we've heard a lot about it since the Interstate 41 designation, but we hear about it in the southern part of the state. We hear about it all over.
Since 1990, 95% of the economic development in Wisconsin has happened within a mile of the infrastructure facilities.
Wow.
That's a striking number.
Yeah, sure.
I'd just like to talk about the debt briefly, if I could.
Please, yeah.
And from a private perspective, one of the things I did share was the Transportation Development Association for Wisconsin. And there is a place for debt. There is a place for bonding in your transportation financing. When you have large multi-generational...
Hold the mic a little closer to your mouth.
When you have large multi-generational projects, and let's just say that the Zoo Interchange and the Marquette Interchange are both those, you're not going to finance projects like that, pay cash for them. And when they're a type of project that's going to last for 50 or 60 years, or should last 50 or 60 years, it makes sense to bond for them. The current bonding levels, as Executive Harris said, 21% is too high. We've got to make a change on that.
All right. Pam, let's go to you next. Yep, there you go. From the tourism perspective, the Convention and Visitors Bureau is all about bringing people in, having them stay a while, leave their money behind, and then head home happy. What role does a quality infrastructure play in that piece of our economy? And it's a pretty big piece in this local economy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And for the state of Wisconsin, really, good roads mean good tourism. The vast majority of Wisconsin's tourism is a drive-to. In other words, they're coming from Illinois, they're coming from Iowa, Minnesota, depending what, and driving into our state. So having those good roads, making the transportation safe and easy to get through to those northern areas in Door County and Bayfield and the Fox Cities where people like to go to vacation is important. And bringing those folks in brings their money, which they spend in our state, and then they go home. So it's a wonderful way to bring more money into the state, but good roads are essential for good tourism.
So before we move on, I want to ask you this. Good roads, often for their maintenance and establishment, require road construction.
Yes.
We talk about having two seasons here in Wisconsin, winter and road construction. Is the road construction and the inconvenience worth the infrastructure that you get in the end from a tourism perspective?
Absolutely. I think I can tell some great tales about the 441-10 interchange. Literally, we would have visitors come into the visitor center, and they'd be coming from, when you think about where our tourism comes from, it comes from northern Wisconsin, central Wisconsin, coming over to Fox River Mall or for a Timber Rattlers game. So you're coming over from Stevens Point on 10, and you can't go north on 41, and they want to get to Fox River Mall. And we had literally had people, over the bridge into Menasha, where am I, in the visitor center, not very happy. It's not a great welcome to the area when they can't get to where they want to go. And visitors, of course, don't know the area well. They don't know the shortcuts. They don't know the back roads. So to have that interchange finally becoming complete, where you can make all the required movements that you should at where two major highways meet, will be essential really for our tourism. Even things like during EIA, which I know Executive Harris has lived through when we have traffic back and forth and we had the 41 project. The county has been great about shutting down the construction during those times to allow those visitors to get back and forth where they need to go, because they recognize the great economic impact that those visitors have. And the visitors are willing to put up with a little bit of inconvenience when they understand we're making progress and making the roads safer and easier for them to access.
Yeah, interesting. Paul, finally, to you on the end down there. You're with Lamers Bus Lines. Talk a little bit about, I mean, your business is literally on the road. Talk a little bit about how quality infrastructure or a lack of quality infrastructure affects the bottom line of your company.
Well, good quality roads definitely are important to us, and the type of improvements that they've been making is awesome. And we see the ability for, in the school bus side of it, we can get to other areas of the community to pick up students, so we stay on time for the routes, and not to be sitting in gridlock like we see a couple times every morning during the week or in the afternoon. But good roads are important so that we can get from point A to point B safely. So we're definitely in support of good quality roads.
So something, you had some of the questions about tolling maybe being a good idea. Talk a little bit now, you said school buses. Lamers also does bus tours, right? So outside of the state of Wisconsin.
Yes.
When you are taking a tour, say, over our southern border into Illinois, where we know they are waiting for us with those toll booths, is that something that you calculate into the price of the trip? Is that something you would then have to pass along to customers? Or is that just a cost of doing business?
It depends. On the motor coach side of things, it's built into the cost because, you know, you have to plan for that. So it's an expense, and ultimately it gets passed on. You know, the thing that I look at is when you talk about tolls and gridlock, you know, anytime you want to take a trip somewhere, everybody, when you hear it, says, oh, well, you got to go through Chicago. Oh, you got to get, you know, bypass Milwaukee or one of those areas. When you have that negative type of a mindset, that's what we do not want to see up here in the Fox Cities is somebody groaning that I have to go through Appleton. I'm looking for a shortcut or go the other way.
Right. And to Phil's point, so much of the development is happening within a mile of highways that if people are avoiding highways, they're really avoiding our business centers too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the long time that I've been here, you know, it's been a long time coming with, we'll call it the old Polish connection, but I swear, since I moved here, it's been on the target to get completed. I'm so excited about, I actually live right kind of in the middle of that whole area, but I'm excited about having where you can go northbound and have easy access.
Right. Every direction available to you, no
Yes.
matter where you're coming from.
Right.
Imagine the convenience. Pam, back to you on this question about tolling or increased gas tax. What kind of an impact would that have on the tourists coming to our area? Or is that something that's not really on their radar?
Actually, from a tourism standpoint, we have talked about it in the industry. The Tourism Federation of Wisconsin is made up of the Convention and Visitors Bureaus, the Restaurant Association, the Hotel and Lodging Association, attractions, outdoor advertisers, and the petroleum marketers, so convenience stores, small business association. Tolling, very much anti-tolling in that industry. It's not welcoming to visitors. It creates bottlenecks. You know, frankly, we don't see it as being of value when you think about, and again, modern tolling is maybe a little bit different than what some of us experience when we go to Chicago, yet it's, you know, potentially closing exits, closing off access to small businesses, hotels, restaurants that are right off those exits, or making it more expensive to get to them because you pay a toll to get off and you pay a toll to get on. So from that standpoint, we don't see tolling as being a thing. When we hear visitors, we have Wisconsin's welcome centers at the borders: Hudson, Janesville, Beloit, Racine, Kenosha. The number one thing that our visitor center staff in those areas anecdotally say is the people from Illinois love that we don't have tolls. They love coming here because they're like, oh, thank God we don't have to pay tolls. Sure. And so there is a perception of, I'm going someplace that's friendlier to me, that's friendlier for me to come to spend my money. From that perspective, you know, we see tolling as probably being a barrier to economic development via tourism.
Okay. Phil, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on tolling from that perspective of road projects, and is it efficient? To a few of the points that were mentioned earlier.
I guess I'd look at it purely from a business standpoint and a return on investment. I question whether or not there's the type of volume of traffic that we need to have tolling be a really viable way to have us finance our transportation improvements. Potentially, I believe, between Chicago, Milwaukee, between Rockford and Chicago, and between Milwaukee and Madison, probably are the only routes that are really financially viable to toll.
And that's based on volume of traffic, the
That's
number
correct.
of cars that would actually go through.
That's correct. I think if we were gonna take a look at tolling between Wapaka and Wausau, you know, we'd go broke on that.
Right, right. Because tolling is an expensive proposition. Installing the actual tolling infrastructure is expensive, right?
That's correct. I had a son that went to school in Northern Illinois, so I got very used to paying tolls along the I-39 and I-88 corridor. And if you buy the transponder, it's very convenient until you get the bill. And you start taking a look at, you know, paying $1.75, $2.75 to go through some of the tolls.
Okay, so the next question for the business end is about public transit. And Phil, you got the mic, we'll start with you. Thoughts about the state investing more, helping local governments fund more public transit options?
There's a segment of population in Wisconsin that, for mobility standpoint, has to have public transportation. There's no question about that. Along with that, we're at a point now where I believe the most recent unemployment numbers in the state is at 4.1%. Might be less than that. I mean, we're at virtual full employment. So if there's anybody who's an able-bodied worker, we have to make sure that they've got a way to get to work. And part of that is having a reliable transit system. And so I think it's critical for our population, for our business community to have that.
Okay. Pam, thoughts on public transit as it relates to enhancing the tourism economy?
Yeah, I do think public transit is something that's seen as a visitor amenity, especially here in the Midwest and maybe not in our big population centers. I think there's an attitude, there's only a certain type of person who uses public transportation, and that's not true. We see visitors in the center daily. They're a trailing spouse. Their spouse is a consultant for here on a long-term assignment with one of our local industries, and they're staying at one of the hotels in the area, and the spouse doesn't have a vehicle because their spouse has it at work, and so they're trying to get from, say, the hotels out in Grand Chute to downtown Appleton to downtown Neenah, and they're finding that to be a barrier because we don't have very efficient public transportation, and those folks who come in from potentially larger metro areas have an expectation. And when you also look at our, I always say everyone's a visitor for the first time. So even a business traveler who's here potentially looking at joining a business here, coming to work for a business here, starting a business here, when you look at it from an economic development standpoint, everyone's a visitor for the first time. And those folks who might be looking to come and join a company here maybe have an expectation, if they're coming from a larger market, of efficient public transportation. And to be able to offer that would open us up to more opportunities with a workforce that is really, truly low, and we need to attract some more of those new millennial workers. That would be an amenity they would look for in an area.
So maybe a need to expand our understanding about who public transit is serving, as well as expanding those options.
Absolutely. I don't think people think that tourists use public transportation, and yet many times they prefer it because, again, you're driving around in an area where you're not real familiar. It's just easier to have somebody else do the driving for you.
Yeah. Paul, public transit at Lamers Bus, this is a big part of what you do. Talk a little bit about how that fits into your business and what additional investment and expanded options might mean for Lamers.
Sure. I mean, obviously, there's always room for all parties in public transportation, such as Valley Transit, as well as the private sector. And there needs to be, the private sector involved. I believe, in my own opinion, here in the Valley, some of the struggles with public transit is access for people to safely get to where the bus stops are. There's just a disconnect with if you want to call them sidewalks. So I think that discourages people from using public transit.
Sort of that last leg of the journey.
That's correct.
From off the bus to your house.
Take your life in your own hands at times because the roads are busy, and so that also needs to be all part of this whole project. But there is, there's still taxis, there's other private sectors that also can benefit from the tourism and provide transportation for all types of people as well.
Yeah. So we all agreed up on this panel that an increased revenue source would be helpful. That if we index the gas tax or some other way direct additional resources into transportation funding, that'd be a good thing. The reality is political leadership in Madison has said no new taxes. This is not the first time political leaders have set that kind of red line for themselves. So if you were going to be saying, okay, if we're going to increase funding for infrastructure and that means reducing funding elsewhere, is there a place where you could see state funding be reduced in order to provide more funding for infrastructure? Opinion? Thoughts?
Well, I think there's probably, you can always squeeze a little more juice out of the lemon. Exactly where that comes from, I'm not sure, but there's only so much you can do, and quite frankly, you cannot borrow yourself out of debt either.
That is very true. Pam, thoughts on this as far as if there's some other place to take that money from, where that might be?
Yeah, I think in general, from a statewide perspective, the tourism industry is, kind of in that, just fix it. You guys just figure this out.
Right.
But I was surprised that many of my cohort were quite amenable to, especially with gas prices being so low, like a gas tax increase. This might have been the time, just from the standpoint of, in the Fox Cities, when I looked at our tourism spending for 2016, the only area that went down was local transportation. And I questioned the researchers on it, and this is a statewide project, and they said, well, the reason people weren't spending less on plane tickets or renting cars, they were spending less on gas because gas prices were so low.
And it looks like lower spending, it's just that they're getting the same amount of gas, it's just costing less.
Right. So, there's certainly an opportunity there, given the price of gas, that might have been something, it could have been easily absorbed.
Yeah. Phil, thoughts on this? If we were going to sort of redirect funds from elsewhere in state government into infrastructure, where might be a good candidate to look for some new funding?
I don't think you can. I don't think you can. I work with any number of highway departments, counties, towns and villages, and I can tell you that I think it's cut down as far as you can. The American Society of Civil Engineers does a infrastructure report card nationally, and Wisconsin does not rank all that well. I mean, they recognize that the infrastructure is in a deteriorating state right now. So I don't think there is anything you can cut. If anything, I think there needs to be acceleration in finding new ways to pay for infrastructure.
Interesting. Thanks for that. All right, I'm actually going to ask the rest of you guys the same question. As far as taking money from elsewhere, and Dean, if you want to pass, you can pass. But thoughts about where we might find, if new revenues aren't on the table, where might we find a little bit of extra juice out of that lemon to put into roads?
Yeah, I think what we've been doing at Outagamie County, and I know others are doing it too, is just trying to find new ways of doing things on maintaining roads, looking at lean government initiatives, looking at just ways of getting more, and that's all we really have. But I do want to say one thing: the state budget was kind this year for maintenance, and that's a great thing. We've reaped some of those benefits, and we're going to put them to good use.
Good. James, thoughts on this?
Well, they could take some money from the county and give it to the municipalities. I think Dean is right on the money here. You have really, it's a simple variable. You have a set amount of revenues and expenditures. Expenditures are the cost of goods, whether it's in raw material or labor or whatever the case may be, never decrease, right? I mean, you can look at that, and if revenues aren't going to keep pace with those expenses, then you can look at efficiencies within the operations. You can only do, I'm sure we're going to talk about some of that later, but if it's operations at the local level or at the county level, Dean brought up lean initiatives or other management tools to try to find efficiencies, and those are all well, but they aren't going to solve the big problem. So yeah, it's time for maybe a deeper dive.
All right, Jeff, thoughts on this? If new revenues weren't on the table, where might we look to put more into infrastructure?
Well, I agree with what Phil said. It can't be done. You can't cut other areas to make up the lost revenue here. And that's why I still say if they go back to indexing to inflation, it's much easier to do. And that was started in 1982, and it had bipartisan support. And that worked until 2006, when they had bipartisan support to repeal it, and it was a mistake. And they need to get back to that position. And as Phil also mentioned, Wisconsin is ranked 49th worst in roads, in infrastructure in the United States, and that's something we certainly shouldn't be proud of.
Well, in all the talk about improving the business climate in the state, that's certainly an indicator that is not working in our favor.
Yeah, and a year ago, last August, the Transportation Development Group sponsored a Just Fix It campaign. And that was successive in every 72 counties for one evening. We hosted one in Outagamie County at Fox Valley Technical College. And all of the speakers there that represented all of the towns and municipalities that came and attended that, every last one of them said, just go back to indexing the gas tax. And that would get us very far down the road where we need to be. Unfortunately, like I said, we've lost 1.2 billion in 11 years, and that is going to be really a challenge to make up.
And meanwhile, borrowed much more than that.
Exactly.
Mark, thoughts on this?
Well, transportation definitely needs an adequate and dedicated source of revenue. And I actually want to dispel a myth. You know, people talk, one time there was a raid on the transportation funds, and that shouldn't have occurred. But the Fiscal Bureau analyzes net transfers of the monies that should be going to things like schools and healthcare into transportation, and the flows from transportation back to the general funds. And over the last 14 years, $560 million more has flowed from the general revenues into transportation. And so to the extent that we continue underfunding transportation and then using general purpose revenue to backfill, we're already raiding funds from other important uses of the money that are underfunded currently.
So to my original question, that's already happening.
Already happening and to a much greater extent than most people realize.
We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, just put that hand up and I'll come out and see you. While I come back to you, Helen, and get that first question from you, I want to throw this one to the table and see if anybody has thoughts on this. We got a comment on Facebook. I've heard this on the show before. There's a belief that if we just licensed vehicles at their appropriate weight, that we could generate enough revenue that we could fix this funding problem. I know that's a DMV state-level issue, but just initial impressions on that as far as if a 2,000-pound vehicle is registered as a 1,000 or a 6,500-pound truck is actually registered as a 4,000-pound. Is this something you guys deal with at Lamers at all in registering your vehicles? Anybody have thoughts on this? Paul, if you do, you can just grab that wired mic right in front of you.
I'm not quite sure, the question was more what?
So when you're registering your vehicle, you're licensing your car, you've got to tell the DMV what kind of car it is. And for different types of vehicles, there are different registration fees. There's a belief that there's vehicles out there that are under-registering. They're telling the state, oh, I'm only a 2,000 pound, and so they're saving $50 on their registration. Is that something you've heard of? Is that something that would make sense to you?
I haven't heard of it. That's new to me. From our industry, a bus is registered as a bus, and there's a fee for that.
Right.
So
A bus is a bus.
a bus is a bus. But if it comes down to, like, you know, personally, I have a pickup truck and I have an automobile. Should the registration be different for that? I'd have to know a little bit more about how that would work, but
Yeah.
it
Anyone
could
else
be
have thoughts
an
about
avenue.
that? Yeah. Anyone else thoughts on the registration question? I mean, this is one that I think is maybe best directed to our state lawmakers, so maybe we'll save it for them. But okay, Helen, you've got a question?
Right.
Thank you.
4 years ago, I was at a meeting for mainly private sector people, and at that point, Reed Ribble was there and the head of Schneider National. Both of them said we need to increase the gas tax. In fact, the head of Schneider National said one of the biggest mistakes they made was to do away with the indexing. I don't hear anything in the community that says we shouldn't raise the gas tax. So how would you recommend we get the legislature to listen to that?
I think that's the $1 million question of the night right there.
Josh,
Yes.
we can't hear
Oh.
what Helen said.
So the question was, if we can all agree that the gas tax should be increased, how do we convince political leadership that there is not grassroots opposition to that? If individuals support it here, Helen's saying that she's been an elected leader, she wasn't hearing opposition to that. Is that something that, how do we convince lawmakers to actually pursue that increase in gas tax funding? James? Yeah, jump on that.
I mean, obviously, you can watch what's going on in Madison, and there's a resistance to raise taxes, which is fine, that's okay. Then my perspective is, if the people in charge of Madison don't want to head that route, then maybe it's upon us as a local region or area or county to take it upon ourselves. And there is a mechanism by which counties can raise funds through sales tax. Two counties represented here don't take advantage of that. Maybe it's time that we say, okay, Madison, you're not going to fix the issue, but we'll take advantage, or we're going to do something about it on our local level. And I've had some conversations, and obviously there's pluses and minuses to all that, and there'd be a lot of details to go into it, but that's one way. If the state or federal isn't going to do anything about it, then we need to do something about it.
Other thoughts on that up on the panel? Yeah, Dean.
Yeah, well, when I was over in Waupaca County, we went and tried to do a wheel tax. And our 5 highway committee members voted for it on the county board floor, and the rest of them voted it down. And their argument was the state should take care of it. Okay, and that's what we're talking about here. I think one of the things too, wheel taxes and other type of taxes, they're all up for, shooting them down, pot shots at them. I think that was something here in the last budget that they were talking about, making wheel tax have to go to a referendum. So I think I think that the locals are very nervous as to what the state's going to do, and the state, as soon as they give you that, all of a sudden over here they take it back away. So I think there's been a lot of bad feelings there. So I think the locals are saying, state, feds, take care of it. Good or bad.
Yeah, on the business end, Phil or Pam, thoughts about how you communicate the need to enhance that gas tax revenue stream to those who may feel political pressure not to support it?
Let's get involved in the political process. I think that's first and foremost. It's letting know your legislators at the state, local level exactly how you feel about the issues. And it might take a change in order for that to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the message, sometimes as industry representatives, we focus on what are the big things in your industry? What are the things you think you really need and you can win? And I think the gas tax might have been one of those where we heard a message that don't even bother, so nobody bothered. And maybe that wasn't necessarily the right approach.
Yeah. Well, and we see now what happened, right? Another $500 million in borrowing for road. Yeah, question?
I have a couple of things. First of all, we do have locals, they're called gas pumps. I think raising gas tax would be a really good idea. But, lost my train of thought. You talked about not raising taxes, and I think maybe that's an issue that some of us in the local areas don't pursue as well as we could, because I don't have a problem paying taxes, because if I want police departments, fire departments, my roads plowed, my roads salted, my potholes fixed, my education system taken care of, my garbage picked up, and my recycling thing. This is something I don't think that local people in government positions get out to people enough, that this is what your taxes pay for. And I know the Republicans are hell-bent on taking taxes away, but every tax they take away takes away a service. And I want my services, I want to maintain those services, and that's something we all have to be better at selling to the public.
Well, I would actually direct that to you, County Executive Harris, as somebody who has run for office, right? You've had to take questions from constituents about these issues of services in exchange for taxes. How do those conversations go?
It's a little dangerous to talk about taxes in all honesty, but we should talk about taxes. We should be honest with our constituents that you've got to balance out what you're spending with your revenues. And if you're not willing to tax for it, you better not spend it. You've got to be balanced in the approach. But I have to tell you, it's a difficult situation. I won't name the organization, but I took a position that there should be a small gas tax increase, basically 3 cents. An organization that had already gone on record calling for a 5-cent increase spent probably $1 million in TV ads against me, condemning me for supporting that 3-cent increase. So when you talk honestly about taxes, your statements are going to be taken out of context and used against you on a political basis. And unfortunately, so much of the public can be influenced by hearing one side of an argument. So that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Jeff, I'd ask you to comment on that same issue. Is talking to voters about taxes in exchange for services, and how do those conversations go?
Well, I think being on the town board and the county board, the closer you are to your constituents, the more you hear from them. I have more dialogue with residents of Grand Chute than I usually do from county residents. And I think you can just take that up the line. You know, assembly people probably have less contact with the voters than we do at the county, and we do at the town or the city or the village. And, you know, by the time you get to the federal level, it really, unless they're having a town hall meeting where they're or addressing a group, there's very little contact there. We had, again, back to the Just Fix It event a year and a half ago, we invited all of the state representatives and assembly people and senators to that meeting that represent Outagamie County. Unfortunately, not all of them came. The few that did heard the message from every one of those spokespeople from the towns and the villages and the cities that are in Outagamie County.
Yeah. And we did not get an indexed gas tax in the 2017-2019 budget.
No, and again, unfortunately, you know, when that was started, like I said, it was a bipartisan effort, and if they, you know, play nice together and index it, then it goes up. Then it's not just a gas tax that they have to raise every, you know, it's adjusted to inflation, so it would adjust with it. In fact, during the period that it existed from 1982 to 2006, it actually went down on 2 occasions, not significantly, but it did.
Yeah. Reflecting those real life economic
Exactly.
conditions. Yeah. Dean, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, with the Just Fix It program, which was headed up by the Transportation Development Association at the state level, which is made up of many, many different groups that are involved in transportation. You know, the League of Municipalities, the Towns Association, the Counties Association, you know, private contractors, engineering groups and all that. So everybody is behind that. That was a great program to get it out there. But, you know, I think back to what Phil said, it takes time. And yes, I think the message got out there. Huge support by all the local municipalities. But now we got through to, you know, one branch of the government. Now there's 2 others. Now we got to keep on, you know, sharing. But it isn't just the government and those branches, it's the people that we got to get out to too and let them know. They're the voters that vote those legislators and the governors into office, and we got to let them know that.
Yeah.
We got, I think, a great opportunity coming up here now with another campaign that hopefully what we can say here is that the governor race should have this as being a very, very big part of the debate.
Yeah.
And I think that would be awesome if we could do that and convince them to talk it. And talk it not just between the 2 or 3 or 4 candidates, but the people. And try to get those people out there to really say, yes, we need this. We got to get going.
Other questions or comments from the audience? Other thoughts? Anybody want to contribute? No? Yeah, sure.
As far as local transportation goes, I think a good example of somewhere we're lagging is out in Greenville. They have that industrial park. All kinds of businesses out there. There's not a bus that runs out there at all. And there's a big chunk of businesses that could probably use some transit.
I know in my background working for the Chamber of Commerce, I work in both economic development capacities and in lobbying capacities. And it's tough to make that case because you can hear from businesses that'll tell you, this is off now, so we can't use that one. They'll tell you, oh, we need workers to come to our gates, right? We need to have good roads to get inputs into our facility. And yet, it's oftentimes organizations on behalf of business that will engage in campaigns to make the case against those kinds of enhanced revenues because they say it creates a bad business climate. And I'm not trying to turn this into a partisan conversation, but there is that perception that business believes taxes are just bad across the board. So from that perspective, Phil, just as somebody who has been active in this in a while, what kind of messaging, what kind of evidence could businesses take to their elected leaders or to their business organizations to try and shift this conversation a little bit?
Well, quite frankly, Wisconsin is primarily agriculture and tourism. Those are the two biggest pieces that we have. And both of those pieces have been behind increasing the gas tax. The State Chamber of Commerce has been for increasing the gas tax. I really haven't heard of anybody who's against it.
Except the governor.
From the business standpoint.
I mean, I'll say it. The governor has said he will not raise the gas tax. And that's his position to take. But then there are consequences to that position. And we've heard, near unanimity about the belief that that would be a good thing, and yet we aren't getting that from our political process, the process which ostensibly reflects the opinion and taste of we the people. So are we not making the right case? Or are there larger forces that are affecting this than what we can bear?
I think there's larger forces
Yeah.
out there. Well, and then on top of that, if you take a look at just from a society standpoint, for a lot of people, transportation is not at the top of the list. Public schools,
great
health
point.
insurance, so transportation doesn't really resonate with them. And then if you take a look at northeastern Wisconsin, Winnebago County is an example. If you just drive through Winnebago County from Milwaukee to Green Bay, you think their transportation system is in great shape because it's Highway 41.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was mentioned over here was the wheel tax. And that's been, James, you mentioned this as a potential act that local governments could take to try and sort of grab the bull by the horns, do something about this on their own. Little Chute does not have a wheel tax. Is it something you have had conversations about with your board or your voters?
We have had preliminary discussions, but let's be honest, Little Chute has roughly, I think at the last count, we had something around 7,000 registered vehicles. If we went with the average $20, we're talking about $140,000 a year. Not that that's not a large amount of money, but at the end of the day, when you're talking a $3 to $4 million road improvement budget, you're really not making a dent, and what impact are you having to the voters? Another thing that we probably don't want to get into discussions about because of the policy rabbit hole we could go down is special assessments. A very unpopular thing, something that Appleton grappled with. I know that other municipalities in the Fox Cities use. Another not very popular tool, but one that is almost relied upon by some municipalities. So there's a number of ways to go. I was thinking as the conversation was being discussed about how do you make transportation get to the top of the list. In a previous life, I worked for Tom Petri. And if he knew that I was talking about transportation, he'd be really proud. And
He would, I can
he
tell
would be
you.
very
he
proud.
would.
And he was a big advocate of transportation. I think, but at the end of the day, I don't think that Governor Walker, good or bad, is really, it's not on top of his priorities. So that being said, I would just go back to my argument that we need to do something then. And if the local representatives in the Assembly or Senate also don't want to join in, then it's on us as local elected or local municipal county leaders.
Yeah. We're seeing in Brown County a program of using room tax and sales tax to invest in facilities and infrastructure projects, a very concrete time frame and list of projects. Now, Outagamie County, Jeff, where you chair the county board, and Winnebago County, Mark, where you are the county executive, do not have their 0.5% county sales tax in place. Is that right? Okay. So you have the option of raising revenues at that county level that you could, if you chose to, dedicate to infrastructure. Jeff, I'll start with you, and Mark will come to you next. Is there a reason you haven't done that, or are you considering doing that?
Well, I can't speak for the full county board. I think at this point, it's certainly something that could be looked at, but that's, you know, we're at a position where it would have to be studied, and then would it be to offset the property tax levy, or would it be in addition to? And I think that's a big question that needs to be answered as well.
Yeah, of course, the details do matter a lot, as I understand it. The Brown
Exactly.
County policy is additional funds that they're bringing in to tackle, or maybe even just move up certain projects on their list. Mark, is that something that you've talked about in Winnebago County, is that half-cent sales tax and what you might be able to do with that?
It's not being considered at this time, but it actually was proposed by me in the past. And the proposal I made, the proceeds from the sales tax would be used to reduce property taxes, both at the county level, and some of those funds were to be shared with the municipalities within the county. And that was the original purpose of that legislation, allowing the sales tax. But it was not popular with the board, and I just don't think that'll come forward anytime soon. But it's only been discussed in the context of being used to reduce property taxes. And of course, with the level of tourism we have in Winnebago County, to a certain extent, when you don't have the sales tax that nearly every other county has, you're overtaxing your property owners to benefit the tourists. And but right now, it's not in the cards.
So, what options are left, right? If people are resistant to new revenues, they feel like there's been tax enough, but there's also this widespread belief that our infrastructure is inadequate, what's it going to take? This is sort of the summary kind of wrap-up thought question, and I'm going to come to everybody on this. If there's something that people who are here, people who are watching, if they were going to take some action on this, what kind of action could we recommend they take?
I think the condition of the roads or the traffic situation has to become bad enough that it becomes a topic of discussion by the general public. And Americans are reasonable people. I think they will eventually put pressure on their elected leaders to get it done.
The political process. Thoughts on that, Jeff? What
Yeah.
steps people could take, or
I agree, and I hate to sound, repetitious here, but, the gas tax, the indexing, I haven't heard from any constituent, any neighbor, any business associate that's opposed to that. In fact, I've heard just the opposite. They would rather spend a couple extra cents at the pump than spending it, because they blew out a tire hitting a pothole, or they paid $89 to have their car realigned.
I've gotten those phone calls on Fresh Take as well. They'd say, I'd much rather spend an extra $1 or $2 every time I fill up than have to get the car realigned, replace the tires, whatever it might be.
Exactly. And, Dean mentioned that, this year in the budget, it's more beneficial to the county, but he's right, it's highway maintenance, and at what expense? The Highway 15 project has been backed up at least another 2 years.
Right.
So you're
Yeah.
not going to fix those things if you don't take action and put something in place that's going to fix the problem.
James, thoughts on any kind of call to action we can give to listeners or viewers?
Well, at the local level, I think it's important that we are more transparent about what our services are. That's a very good point. I think, local government has the ability to be as transparent as any level of government, quite frankly, and so that's important. I don't necessarily know, obviously people could call their local legislators. I think it was less than a year ago that there was a viral video of a car out on 41, that was brake checked, and then, those types of things are just going to continue. And, our local fire department, we're in the middle of that congestion area.
Right.
And our calls for service just for accidents are up, almost 10, 15, 20% every year since I've been in the village. So that's not sustainable. We're putting our volunteer firemen in harm's way. And unfortunately, like many things, it takes almost a catastrophe to signal Because if we're 10 to 15 years out from that even, from 41 being improved, then we're, that's probably what it would take.
Well, you make a good point there. The increased calls for service to those accidents and incidents on 41 coming from a local government, it's almost a hidden cost of the deferment of these projects.
Absolutely. Actually, today I had a conversation with staff about procuring equipment to respond simply to vehicle incidents on I-41.
Because that's your responsibility when that happens as the municipality that contains
correct.
that stretch, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Dean, thoughts on call to action for residents here in Outagamie County or anyone who might be watching, how we might motivate action on this issue?
I think bottom line is that we all have to become very passionate for this cause. That sounds just like a bunch of words, but it's true. When you see people getting in accidents and getting hurt and dying, then everybody all gets up in arms. And we hate to see and wait for that stuff to happen. People say, do you have to wait till somebody gets killed before you do something? We don't want to, but it is a lot of times that's what happens. So I do think the people, local officials, businesses, the taxpayers have to have a vision, a real vision of how we want transportation to look into the future. I have 4 kids, 3 of them are in college, and I hope each and every one of them come back home to live here. And I think that's the passion in my heart, that I want them to come home. I think every one of us kind of would like that too. We got to make this community viable. We got to have businesses that are viable. Got to have employees that are, abundant. We're fully, almost fully employed right now. We got to have it where we're able to do that. We got to be able to attract that. Our community has to attract it, and transportation is one of those areas. And we have to be passionate about it, have a vision. One other thing I want to say too is the DOT, is getting a big bad rap here right now too. And I think they've done a lot of very good things. Any organization that large can do better, but they've been getting a bad rap. And I think what we need to do is go back, make sure we're taking care of the infrastructure that's been invested in, and take care of all the hard work people have done and paid for, and we take care of that as long as we can. But then you have to have that plan for the future to say, now how are we going to systematically account, with good accounting, financial, stability, going through there and making sure we move into the future. And you got to have a vision. We have to have, I think, a leader or several leaders that really put that vision out there, and I think people will jump on that and go with it, and it will happen. It's happened before. I think it can happen again.
Yeah. Final thoughts, calls to action, how we get going on this.
I think we have to stay the course. We have to communicate with the politicians. Hopefully there's going to be a change of philosophy in Madison. I do think hopefully what doesn't happen is that a catastrophe happens and then we realize that we need more dollars in transportation. And when I think about what could have been a really catastrophic event was the failure of Leo Frigo Bridge back in 2013. Bridge deck went down at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. We were on site. Omni Associates was on site at 7:30. We were part of the solution. And at that point, I can remember the people from Madison coming down, the politicians talking about, geez, we finished 2 or 3 months ahead of time. We finished millions of dollars ahead of budget we thought we were going to do. We really have to get a better way to fund transportation. There was that feeling in the room that it was going to happen. And now it's 4 or 5 years later and we're still not there. I hope it doesn't take a catastrophe like that.
Pam, final thoughts?
I think we've talked about a lot of different things. I think talking to what Dean said, it's our philosophy. Are we going to be a car culture where everyone drives in their own car? I'm guilty. I stared this morning at my son as a freshman down at Madison, riding his bike around Madison. And his car is sitting in my driveway, and I'm going to be shoveling around it all winter long. Okay, full disclosure, my husband's going to be shoveling around it all winter long. But are we going to be a car culture, or are we going to embrace public transportation, trails, bike ped plans that maybe take some of the stress off of our infrastructure, make it last longer. And that's kind of a philosophical change we might have to look at as a community. It might be one way of approaching this.
Yeah. Paul, last thoughts?
I pretty much agree with everyone here. You know, long-term, we can't just look at today. We have to look at, you know, where are we going to be? Where are roads going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? And what's the population growth going to be? What is industry? What type of employees are we looking for? Where will they be coming from? And if we're not prepared for that, I just think we're doing a disservice to this area.
Yeah. I do 2.5 hours of radio 5 days a week, and we've had just about 90 minutes here, and it still feels like we're just scratching the surface on this, but I've come to just accept that with big topics like this, we're not going to be able to get to the bottom of it in any reasonable time frame that we could all endure sitting here. So I have my final thoughts, but before I offer mine, I want to say thanks to our panelists, Paul Menon from Lamers Bus Lines, Pam Seidel from the Fox Cities Convention and Visitors Bureau, Phil Ramlett from Omni Associates, Dean Steingraber, Outagamie County Highway Commissioner, James Fenlon, Little Chute Village Administrator, Jeff Nguyen, Outagamie County Board Chair and Grand Chute Town Board Member, and Mark Harris, Winnebago County Executive. Thanks you all for being a part of this conversation. Okay, my last thought on this. You heard a bit of it in the final thoughts here on the panel. We hope it doesn't take a crisis, and yet we've seen crisis. And it passes, and nothing happens. In our country, we're having a conversation like this right now about guns. We see people mowed down by individuals, deranged or otherwise, with firearms, and we say something must be done. No matter what you think must be done, we want something done. We want action. And when days pass, and weeks pass, and years pass, and nothing is done, our frustration fades. We get used to the status quo until the next moment of urgency. But those moments of urgency are leaving families broken. They're leaving communities shattered. And we are accepting that as voters. Our representatives aren't doing anything. And here in Wisconsin, while it may be lower stakes than the gun debate on the national stage, I'm not so sure it's lower stakes, given the importance to our economy and the future vitality of our state. So if we could apply the same passion that we have for something like gun control, or whatever that issue is for you, think about how often you use roads or public transportation, or how often you buy something that came into our state on the back of a truck. And if all of those things were gone, how different your life would be. And then take all of that energy and passion and direct it into communicating with your representatives at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. Because it's going to take all units to get this thing right, but if they don't feel the pressure, they're never going to do it. And I usually start my show with the takeaway, but that's the end today. And so I appreciate you all being here, everyone who's viewing at home. Thank you for participating, and thank you all for coming out here tonight, and we'll do it again real soon. Thanks a lot.